The instructor hadn't expected anyone to notice the trap before class started, least of all the human. Professor Viacore prided himself on his ability to break overconfident cadets. For 37 cycles, he had taught advanced tactical scenario analysis at the Calaris Defense Academy, and in all those years, not a single student had bypassed his opening day initiation. It wasn't lethal, of course. The Academy frowned on killing its own, but it was designed to humiliate. Subtle enough to blend into the training hall's environment, lethal-looking enough to make someone panic, and clever enough that even the veterans who returned for refresher courses failed to outwit it. This year's class was a strange mix: several lithe, chitin-armored Severans, a bulky Troxian pair who looked like walking siege engines, a Silari with its quill-covered hide, and one human. Just one. Viacore had seen the name on the roster: Cadet Daniel Reeve. He'd been curious, yes, but not overly concerned. Humans were still a novelty at the academy, and most were quick learners but rarely outperformed the seasoned warriors of older starfaring species. They lacked claws, venom, or natural armor. Their edge lay in adaptability, not raw combat skill. But adaptability was exactly what Viacore intended to break today. The trap was already armed. The training hall's glossy black floor concealed thin magnetic filaments under a polymer layer, invisible to the naked eye but ready to activate when pressure sensors triggered them. Overhead, the ceiling's structural beams concealed microprojectors, waiting to unleash a dazzling storm of disorienting strobe patterns. And hidden along the far wall were compact grav flux emitters, harmless in small bursts, but strong enough to make an unsteady cadet stumble, exposing them to a low-impact, non-lethal kinetic dart volley from an automated turret. The idea wasn't to injure. It was to force mistakes in front of the entire class, to crush overconfidence before the first real lesson even began. At precisely 0800 hours, cadets began to filter in. They talked, laughed, some stretched or adjusted their uniforms. The air hummed faintly with the baseline power of the hall's environmental systems. Daniel Reeve strolled in at 0803. His uniform was regulation, his hair was slightly messy as if he hadn't spent more than 30 seconds on it, and his gait was lazy but deliberate. A few Severans gave him quick, appraising glances, predatory, competitive, and dismissed him immediately. He didn't join the conversations. Instead, he scanned the hall in silence. His eyes lingered on the ceiling for a few seconds too long. Then on the far wall. Then on the floor. Viacore, watching from the observation balcony above, narrowed his eyes. Most cadets came in with their attention scattered, laughing or flexing in front of their peers. The human was doing reconnaissance. Daniel drifted toward the center of the room. His footstep paused midair for a fraction of a second before lowering, almost imperceptibly lighter than before, as if he was testing the floor. He knelt and tied his bootlace, twice, in different locations, each time glancing upward afterward. And then he smiled. It wasn't a big smile. Just a faint, knowing curve of the lips. But Viacore recognized that expression. It was the look of someone who had just figured out the punchline before the joke had been told. Interesting, Viacore murmured, taloned fingers tapping the railing. By 0805, the rest of the cadets had arrived. A few had noticed Daniel's quiet movements, but most were too busy posturing. The Troxians were mock-shoving each other. The Silari was fanning its quills in an intimidation display toward the Severans. Daniel took a few casual steps backward, positioning himself near the far left corner of the room, a location Viacore knew to be just outside the grav flux emitter's strongest range. The magnetic filaments beneath that section of floor were slightly misaligned due to an old installation error. No one knew about it. No one except the technician who had laid them. Is he? One of Viacore's assistant instructors leaned forward, frowning. He's not avoiding the trigger zones, is he? Viacore didn't answer. He wanted to see how far the human's awareness went. At 0810, Viacore descended from the balcony, his heavy frame making the polymer floor creak under his weight. Conversation stopped instantly. The professor's presence had that effect: 7 feet of armored carapace, ridged mandibles, and the kind of stillness that came from decades of real combat. Cadets, Viacore began, voice resonant. Today, before we begin your first tactical theory module, we will have a practical evaluation. An exercise in observation, reaction, and adaptation. A few cadets straightened, puffing up with anticipation. The Troxians grinned in a way that suggested they were already imagining themselves winning. You will line up along the east wall, Viacore continued. And at my signal you will cross to the west wall. That is all. There is no time limit. There are no points awarded for speed. There are consequences for failure. This drew a few smirks. They all knew consequences usually meant ending up on the floor in a daze while the rest of the class laughed. Begin. The cadets moved. The first Severin stepped confidently forward, and the floor lit up under his foot with a faint blue glow as the magnetic filaments activated. A split second later, the grav flux kicked in, and the poor creature stumbled sideways into the dart turret's targeting range. 3 harmless but humiliating foam darts smacked into his torso. Laughter rippled across the line. The next cadet tried to leap over the suspected danger zone, only to get blinded by the strobe projectors and land badly, sprawling with a hiss of frustration. Daniel didn't move. He watched. Measured. Waited for the chaos to play out, noting exactly where each trigger activated, how the projectors tracked movement, and how the grav flux emitted its invisible shove. By the time the 5th cadet had been tagged by darts, the rest were hesitating. Even the Troxians had slowed their confident strides. Then Daniel stepped forward. Not in a straight line, his path curved gently, each step precise. He moved like someone pacing out a dance they already knew by heart. Twice he slowed as if distracted, using the moment to time the flicker pattern of the strobes above. When he crossed into the section with grav flux coverage, he angled his stride in a subtle zigzag, counterbalancing the force so that it slid past him like wind against a sail. The turret swiveled toward him, and then stopped, unable to lock on. Daniel had kept himself positioned just behind the magnetic filament's activation threshold, forcing the targeting subroutine to reset each time. When he reached the west wall, he didn't turn dramatically or pump his fist. He just looked over his shoulder at Viacore with a raised eyebrow. The room was silent. For the first time in 37 cycles, someone had crossed without triggering a single part of the trap. The Troxians were staring. The Severins looked irritated. The Solaris' quills were flat with surprise. Viacore folded his arms. Cadet Reeve. You seem familiar with this kind of environment. Daniel shrugged. Floor patterns were too clean. Perfectly uniform texture usually means a resurfaced job, which means someone had a reason to hide something underneath. Ceilings too symmetrical for this sector's standard build. Overcompensated beams mean there's extra weight hidden inside. As for the grav flux, your east wall emitters aren't perfectly aligned. Probably a 2-degree offset from the original install. Several cadets blinked, not understanding half of what he'd said. Viacore's mandibles clicked slowly. He wasn't impressed often. And how did you know that? Daniel's grin was faint, almost lazy. My uncle's a stage magician back on Earth. You grow up learning how to spot hidden mechanisms before you sit down in the audience. That actually drew a chuckle from one of the Troxians. Viacore studied him for a long moment. This was not the reaction he'd expected. Instead of panicking or blundering into the trap like everyone else, the human had treated it like a puzzle, and solved it before it even began. That was inconvenient. It also meant Viacore's lesson for the day had just changed. The rest of the cadets were still murmuring about what they had just witnessed when Viacore ordered everyone back to the east wall. His heavy footsteps echoed through the training hall, and that alone was enough to silence them. Impressive, Viacore said, his tone almost too calm. But today's lesson was never meant to be easy. If the first obstacle was a test of observation, the second will be a test of adaptability under pressure. Daniel caught the faintest shift in the professor's stance, like someone about to raise the stakes in a game they were not planning to lose. From somewhere behind the far wall, machinery hummed to life. The floor panels began to split and shift, folding down in precise mechanical choreography. Entire sections of the room retracted into the walls and ceiling, revealing a sprawling, multi-tiered obstacle course bristling with unfamiliar tech. The murmurs turned into low, uneasy exclamations. Even the Troxians, usually so confident, narrowed their eyes. The new setup looked like a hybrid between a combat zone and a construction site built by someone who hated straight lines. The floor now had raised platforms, suspended beams, and thin, shifting walkways. Several ceiling-mounted drones hovered into view, their weapon slots capped but obviously functional. "This is your real exercise," Viacor announced, his voice carrying over the mechanical whine of the drones. "Your goal is to reach the command node on the far platform and disable it before the scenario's defensive systems neutralize you. The environment will change dynamically. The course will adapt to your actions." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before adding, "And this time, Cadet Reeve, you will go first." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then gave the slightest shrug. "Sure." A few Severans exchanged smirks. Going first meant being the guinea pig, the one who triggered all the unknown dangers for everyone else to learn from. Viacor keyed in a command on his wrist console, and the drones shifted formation. "Begin." Daniel stepped forward onto the first platform. Immediately, a drone zipped toward him, firing a rapid volley of harmless but high-impact gel rounds. He ducked behind a low barrier just in time, the rounds splattering against the polymer shield with wet thumps. He didn't stay in cover. Instead, he moved sideways along the platform, forcing the drone to constantly adjust its angle. He noticed how its tracking slowed each time he crossed from one platform to another. The sensor recalibration lag was small but exploitable. From the balcony, Viacor's eyes narrowed. Daniel sprinted toward a narrow beam suspended over a 3-meter drop. Halfway across, the beam began to tilt, shifting his center of balance. Instead of panicking, Daniel leaned into the tilt, lowering his body's center of gravity, and moved faster, using the beam's shift to carry him toward the opposite platform. One of the Troxians muttered, "He moves like this is a playground." It wasn't a compliment. The next section was worse, a grid of shifting floor tiles, each one programmed to retract into the void below if too much weight rested on it for more than 2 seconds. Daniel tested the first tile with his toe, counted under his breath, and then crossed 3 tiles in a burst of quick steps. When one began to drop, he used its downward motion to launch himself onto a rising tile, rolling into a crouch. From above, Viacor adjusted the scenario settings. The drones shifted again, this time activating small energy projectors that created blinding bursts of light directly in Daniel's path. Daniel shielded his eyes with one hand and slowed, but not in panic. He angled himself toward the nearest vertical support beam, gripping it as the light flared again, using it as a reference point. "Bright lights to disorient, but no noise generators," he muttered. "Guess we're sticking to visual overload." Another step, and the floor dropped out from under him. The crowd gasped, but instead of plummeting, Daniel grabbed the lip of the falling tile and swung his legs forward, catching the edge of the next platform. He pulled himself up with a grunt. Viacor's assistant leaned closer. "He's not reacting like a cadet, sir. He's anticipating." "I see that," Viacor said, his tone clipped. The course adapted again. Sections of wall began to slide inward, narrowing the available path. One drone switched to deploying smoke screens, obscuring Daniel's line of sight. He slowed here. Not because of fear, but because of calculation. He moved low, one hand trailing the floor to detect subtle changes in texture. His other hand brushed against the wall at intervals, keeping his orientation steady. When the smoke thinned just enough for visibility, he was already at the edge of the next platform. From the far side of the hall, the command node loomed, a spherical console surrounded by a trio of defense turrets. Reaching it would require crossing an open platform with zero cover. Daniel crouched, scanning the turrets. He noticed the barrels twitch slightly every few seconds, even when not firing, a sign of constant recalibration. That meant they had a blind moment between target acquisition and firing. When the nearest turret's twitch came, Daniel sprinted, not in a straight line, but in a serpentine pattern, forcing each turret to track him at the worst possible angles. The first volley went wide. The second came too late. By the third, he was already at the console, dropping into a slide that carried him under the last burst of gel rounds. His hand slammed onto the node's main panel. The turrets froze. The drones powered down. The course fell silent except for the faint hum of the mechanical systems returning to standby. From the balcony, Viacore stared down at him. The rest of the cadets were silent. No one had ever seen the first runner make it through on the first attempt. Daniel stood, brushing gel residue from his sleeve. So that it? Viacore's mandibles twitched in what might have been irritation, or, grudgingly, amusement. Return to the east wall, Cadet Reeve. Daniel walked back, and the crowd parted for him without a word. Even the Troxians kept their comments to themselves. Once everyone was lined up again, Viacore said, "You have just witnessed a demonstration of two traits that will keep you alive: analysis and adaptability. Most of you attempted the first course with assumption, not observation. Most of you would have attempted the second with speed, not calculation." He looked directly at Daniel. "But adaptability has limits. Tomorrow we will see where yours end." Daniel didn't flinch. "Looking forward to it." The class ended with more murmurs than when it began. The Severans looked at Daniel like he was an anomaly that needed explaining. The Troxians looked at him like a challenge. The Silari just stared, unblinking. As the cadets filed out, Viacore remained on the balcony, watching Daniel go. He keyed a private message to the scenario systems technician: tomorrow. Maximum complexity. No preset patterns. Full environmental randomization. If the human wanted a challenge, Viacore intended to give him one. By the next morning, word had spread. It wasn't just Daniel's own class whispering about the human who had crossed Viacore's first trap without triggering it, and then completed the second scenario on his first attempt. Cadets from other cohorts were loitering near the observation decks, trying to get a view of the day's session. Daniel walked in at the same casual pace as before, his hands in his pockets, a half-smile on his face like he'd been invited to watch, not compete. The Severans gave him narrowed looks. The Troxians looked like they'd been betting on whether he'd crash and burn this time. The Silari tilted its head with that unsettling stillness of its kind. Viacore was already waiting, standing on the central platform. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Cadets, today's exercise will be different. There will be no observation round, no time to memorize patterns, and no chance to exploit flaws in the course design. This will be an adaptive combat environment with maximum randomization." He gestured toward the far wall, and the floor panels shifted again. But this time, instead of revealing a fixed course, the environment seemed alive, shifting platforms, rising walls, rotating beams, and moving obstacles that didn't stop even when idle. Drones hovered overhead, each equipped with multiple weapon modules. Floor plates glowed with unpredictable pulses. The environmental systems whirred with an intensity none of the cadets had heard before. Viacore's mandibles twitched into something close to a grin. "Your goal remains the same: reach and disable the command node. But the environment will actively respond to your choices, and it will attempt to predict them. If you adapt, it will adapt faster." He looked directly at Daniel. "You will begin alone. The rest of the class will observe." Daniel stepped forward without hesitation. The moment his boot touched the first platform, the system came alive. A panel to his left shot upward, blocking the obvious path. Two drones zipped in from opposite angles, one firing gel rounds, the other launching a net. Daniel dropped into a crouch, letting the gel burst hit the wall, then rolled under the net's arc. Before his feet even touched the next platform, a vertical beam swung across like a pendulum. He caught the edge of it, using its momentum to sling himself onto a lower platform. The system reacted instantly. The lower platform split into 4 moving sections, each gliding away from the others. Daniel jumped to the nearest, landing in a crouch as a drone dove at him, now firing disorienting strobe bursts. He didn't look at the drone. He looked at its shadow. The strobe made direct tracking impossible, but the shadow's flicker pattern revealed its movement. He sidestepped just as it fired again, the gel splattering harmlessly against the floor. The crowd above murmured. No one had ever read the environment like this before. Daniel's path forward was a set of platforms that rose and fell in seemingly random intervals. He stepped onto the first, and it immediately dropped faster than the rest. Instead of panicking, Daniel jumped halfway down its descent, catching a protruding horizontal support beam and swinging himself to the next platform at the peak of its rise. The system recalibrated again. This time, a floor section ahead of him glowed red, then exploded upward, sending debris-like foam projectiles into the air. Daniel ducked, letting them pass overhead, but one bounced off the far wall and came straight at him. Without looking, he twisted, letting it graze past his side. Viacor watched closely from the control station. He had programmed this iteration with true chaos. No preset sequences, only an adaptive AI that analyzed the runner's decision-making speed, movement patterns, and reaction timing. For it to fail, Daniel needed to be forced into an unwinnable corner. The AI attempted exactly that. 3 drones descended in a triangle formation, driving Daniel toward a narrow bridge. As soon as his weight hit the first step, the bridge began retracting into the wall. Beneath was a yawning gap with no visible handholds. Daniel didn't retreat. He sprinted, leaping the last 2 meters before the bridge fully withdrew, and landed in a crouch on the far platform. The AI adapted again, now deploying multiple hazards at once. The floor tilted, smoke flooded the air, and a turret activated behind him, firing rapid gel rounds. The smoke was meant to disorient. The tilt was meant to throw him into the turret's firing lane. Daniel used both against it, letting the tilt carry him toward the smoke's edge, where he crouched low enough that the turret overshot him entirely. He emerged from the smoke and found himself facing a vertical climb, the final approach to the command node. The wall was studded with shifting grips, some of which retracted the instant they were touched. Above, drones patrolled in lazy circles, ready to fire at any target in open view. Daniel studied the wall for 3 seconds. Then he didn't climb it. Instead, he turned and ran back toward one of the lower platforms he had passed earlier. He jumped, grabbed a swinging beam, and used its motion to hurl himself upward, not toward the climb, but toward one of the patrolling drones. The drone reacted too slowly. Daniel grabbed its housing, yanking its stabilizers just enough to force it into an unplanned ascent. Using it as a moving platform, he rode it up and over the wall's edge, dropping directly onto the command node's platform. The turrets activated instantly, but they were calibrated for climbing routes, not aerial approaches. Their targeting algorithms lagged by half a second, just enough for Daniel to slide under their arcs and slam his palm onto the node's control panel. The entire environment froze. Platforms stopped moving. Drones hovered in standby. The smoke dissipated. Daniel stood, brushing dust from his hands. "Your AI needs a hobby." The observation deck erupted in noise, cheers from some, incredulous mutters from others. The Troxians looked both impressed and irritated. The Severans stared like they'd just witnessed a statistical impossibility. Viacor descended from the control station slowly, his gaze fixed on Daniel. "You bypassed the climb entirely." Daniel shrugged. "You said the goal was to disable the node. You didn't say I had to use the route you expected." The Solari's quills rustled in what might have been approval. Viacor stopped a few meters from him. "You realize that in a real combat zone, improvisation like that could cost you. Or win the fight before it starts," Daniel interrupted lightly. "Depends on who's thinking slower." The air between them held a taut silence for a moment. Then Viacor's mandibles twitched in what might have been reluctant amusement. "Very well. You've proven you can beat the environment. Tomorrow, we'll see if you can beat something that thinks back." Daniel gave him a short, almost playful nod. "Looking forward to it." The rest of the cadets filed out in hushed tones. The rumor mill would be running at full speed tonight. But Daniel had already stopped thinking about their reactions. He was wondering what Viacor meant by something that thinks back. And for the first time, he suspected tomorrow's challenge might be more than just a test. The next morning, the training hall felt different. The air had that faint metallic tang of freshly powered hardware, and a low vibration hummed through the floor, deeper than the usual environmental systems. Every cadet from Daniel's class was present, but now they were joined by at least 30 more from other divisions. Word had spread so far that even a few instructors from other programs had shown up, leaning against the upper railing like spectators at an arena fight. Viacore stood on the central platform again, but this time there was no obstacle course behind him. Just a single, circular combat ring surrounded by retractable walls. The floor was glossy black, unmarked by tiles or seams. Above, the ceiling's lights glowed in a harsh white arc. This, Viacore began, voice carrying through the echoing space, is the Combat AI prototype, designation VRX Prime. It is not a course. It is not a pattern. It is a thinking opponent. A murmur swept through the crowd. Even the Troxians straightened. Viacore continued. Prime learns. It adjusts not only to your movements, but to your thinking. It has been programmed with data from over 12,000 live engagements across 53 species combat histories. It has beaten veteran soldiers. It has beaten instructors. His gaze locked on Daniel. It will try to beat you. The walls retracted, revealing the AI unit, a sleek, 2-meter-tall bipedal frame of matte black plating, its joints lined with faint blue light. No visible weapons, but the broad shoulders and reinforced forearms suggested strength over subtlety. Its head was a smooth, featureless dome. Daniel tilted his head slightly. No facial expressions? That's a shame. Makes it hard to tell when I'm getting on its nerves. A ripple of chuckles spread through the crowd. Viacore didn't react. Begin, he said. Prime moved instantly. No hesitation, no posturing. It crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, its right arm snapping forward in a piston-like punch. Daniel sidestepped, the blow slicing past him, but Prime pivoted mid-strike, its other arm swinging in a backhand. Daniel dropped into a crouch, feeling the air shift above his head as the strike missed by centimeters. Prime didn't pause. It adjusted, its foot lashing out in a low sweep. Daniel hopped back, letting the kick slice through empty space, then darted sideways to test the AI's pursuit. It was fast. Too fast. By the third exchange, Daniel realized Prime wasn't just tracking his body, it was predicting. The AI's strikes were coming just ahead of where he moved, forcing him to break his own rhythm to avoid being caught. He changed direction abruptly, lunging forward instead of away. Prime's strike, meant for where he should have been, passed harmlessly behind him. He drove a palm strike toward its chest, and felt like he'd hit a steel wall. Prime caught his wrist. The grip was crushing. Daniel twisted, dropping his weight and spinning free just as Prime's other hand came up in what looked suspiciously like an elbow strike learned from human martial arts footage. The crowd was silent except for the thud of impacts and the scrape of boots on the floor. Daniel needed information. Prime had no obvious weak points. Its frame was reinforced, and its AI was learning his patterns faster than he could break them. He switched to a feigned heavy style, throwing in movements that weren't attacks, shoulder dips, false shifts of balance, even an outright stumble. Prime reacted to all of them, recalibrating with ruthless efficiency. But Daniel saw something. The recalibration wasn't instant. It was fractions of a second, but enough. He started layering feints inside feints, a step forward suggesting a strike, followed by a spin away, which then became a low sweep. Prime blocked the sweep, but its counter came a heartbeat late. That was all Daniel needed. He lunged, not at Prime's torso, but at its legs, using his momentum to crash into its knee joint. The plating there didn't give, but the unexpected force made Prime adjust its stance. It shifted weight, and Daniel knew he had it. Prime's balance recovery sequence involved planting one foot exactly 3 degrees wider than before. He saw it happen twice. If it happened again, Prime came at him in a flurry, forcing Daniel into a defensive role. When he came up, he charged directly at the AI, throwing a series of wild-looking strikes, most of which missed on purpose. Prime stepped into its balance recovery stance again. Daniel moved. His left foot hooked behind its planted leg. His right hand grabbed the upper arm, and his body twisted in a way that looked sloppy but was pure leverage. Prime's center of gravity tipped, and before it could adjust, Daniel used the tilt, not to throw it, but to drive it backward into the combat ring's floor. The thud echoed through the hall. Prime tried to rise, but Daniel was already moving, reaching for the panel at the back of its head. His fingers found a recessed maintenance port, likely intended for technicians. He jammed 2 fingers inside, pressing down on the manual reset switch. Prime froze. The blue lights in its joints dimmed to nothing. The silence in the hall was deafening. Daniel stood, breathing hard, brushing his hands off like he just finished fixing a stubborn piece of machinery. Viacor descended from the control station slowly, eyes locked on him. "You defeated Prime in under 5 minutes." Daniel shrugged. "It learned faster than me. So I stopped teaching it." The Solari's quills rustled in what might have been laughter. Viacor stopped a meter away. For the first time, his mandibles twitched in something that might actually have been respect. "Your methods are unconventional. Risky. Sometimes bordering on reckless." Daniel smirked. "You make it sound like that's a bad thing." Viacor studied him for another long moment. "Cadet Reeve, you may just survive this academy." The crowd erupted, some in cheers, some in disbelief, but all in acknowledgement. The human had beaten the traps, the adaptive environment, and now the thinking machine. As the cadets filed out, Daniel lingered just a moment, glancing back at the inert AI. "Tell Prime I said thanks for the dance," he muttered before heading for the exit. Viacor watched him go, the corners of his mouth curling into the faintest hint of a smile. The lesson he had planned for these cadets was long gone. A new one had replaced it, that sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't the strongest, or the fastest, or even the smartest. It was the one who refused to play by the rules at all. And he had a feeling this human was just getting started. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more tales from the edge of the galaxy, where humans break the rules, and the universe learns to adapt.